Hi everybody, good evening. It's my great honor this evening to chair this event convened by the Center for Islamic Shi'a Studies. We're fortunate enough to have with us Professor Sajjad Rizvi, Associate Professor of Islamic Intellectual History from the University of Exeter, for the final lecture in the series Shi'a Narratives of Formative Muslim History, Debate and Disputation in the Crucible of Early Theology in Islam, the Munaẓarāt of Imām ʼAlī bin Mūsā al-Riḍā. Professor Rizvi is considered a leading authority on the Safavid philosopher Munaẓarāt, and his expertise they stretch far beyond the confines of Safavid Iran. He's quite prolific, as I'm sure many of you know, and his writings sort of cover quite are many and varied. He has Munaẓarāt, his life and works on the sources of Safavid philosophy, which came out in 2007. Munaẓarāt of Metaphysics, which was in 2009. Most recently, an anthology of current commentaries with Faraz Hamza and Farahana Maya, which came out in 2010, and he's due to have two more monographs, a further one on Munaẓarāt, I believe, which will be his third one, and another one on Riḍā, which is due to be published soon, hopefully. Over the last couple of years that I've come to know Professor Rizvi, I've never been ceased to be impressed by the breadth of his research interest. They are, again, like his publications, many and varied, and he's always managed to sort of strike a balance between the role of the public sort of intellectual and a great deal of scholarly rigor. From the early history of Qur'an, in the formative period of the Shi'a faith, to Safavid philosophy, cutting-edge debates on religious pluralism, and the contemporary politics of Iraq and Bahrain, Professor Rizvi continues to bring his own fresh and formidable perspective to bear in its most trying and demanding times. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor over to Professor Rizvi. We should be going on to about 7:45, and then there will be time for questions, which will be another 45 minutes or so. So hopefully in the course of the lecture you can sort of think of provocative and thoughtful comments, which I'm sure Professor Rizvi will appreciate and try to respond to. Thank you.
Many thanks, Iskander, and many thanks for the few of you who've made it out this autumn evening. But you know, the Shi'i tradition loves the few and has many sayings about, you know, in praise of the few. So you are indeed the khawas who have made it here. What I'm actually going to talk about is slightly outside of what I normally do, for those of you who do know me. But it comes in from something which I am interested in, which is a Safavid period. And the actual text I'm going to talk about, the interesting thing about it is that all of the major commentaries on this particular disputation encounter actually come from the Safavid period and come from philosophers of the Safavid period. But I want to actually start on a slightly different note and try and link in perhaps with the previous two lectures and say something about maybe the formative period of Shi'i thought and how we might actually study that formative period. And perhaps it will become clear that my own perhaps hermeneutical commitments are much closer to Amir Mirzi than Madlung, as will be clear. The point I want to start at is a cluster of very famous sayings which are narrated in the earliest, or at least the second earliest collection of Shi'i narrations, namely the Basair al-Darajat of Safar al-Qummi. And in that, there's a cluster of sayings about how the Shi'i cause, or the cause of the Imams, is something which is particularly difficult and arduous. It's Sa'ab Mustas'ab in the language. And that those who have decided to adhere themselves to this particular path are not necessarily going to find things easy. And in one, there's three famous variants of this particular saying. In the first variant it says, Amruna, our matter, our affair, our cause perhaps, is difficult, it's arduous, and it's one which only those three categories of individuals can bear it, can convey it, can carry it forward. One of those categories, of course, is a prophet, a messenger of God who is sent. The second category of people who are capable of bearing this and conveying it, of course, are the cherubim, the angels closest to the throne of the divine. And the third category is a believer whose heart is tested by his faith, by God for his faith, a mu'min who's mumtahan. And what it really already indicates is that with the early Shi'i tradition, when the collation and the codification of these texts were taking place in the 9th century, there was already a recognition that being Shi'i was somehow difficult. It was about affiliating yourself with a marginal community which at times felt besieged and persecuted. And it also meant that you were affiliating yourself with a sense of confusion and perplexity. You weren't necessarily aware or entirely understood how to take things forward. You didn't even necessarily understand perhaps what the authentic nature of the message that the Imams were conveying was. There were, as we know, a number of conflicts from the two extremes about the very nature of the Imams themselves. There were conflicts between what we now, and of course even then, was called ghulu and taqsir, those who had an exaggerated notion of the status of the Imams, and those who perhaps had shortcomings in what they thought about the Imams. And the central point of that status related to knowledge. What was the extent of the knowledge of the Imams? How did one see that? Did they have perfect knowledge? Did they have access to divine knowledge? Did they, in a sense, have a God's eye view of what was going on? Or rather, were they just very good jurists who had a perfect understanding of what the law was and had a fairly clear understanding of what the grammar and the basic message of the Quran was? And I won't say much more about that. I'm just highlighting the question of knowledge because those who are interested can, of course, read Tamima's PhD, which precisely deals with the question of knowledge in that period. Now, the second aspect of the confusion of the 9th century, or the perplexity, related to how, in a sense, what sort of epistemology was a believer to have, and in particular, how was the believer to understand this concept of aql that was put forward in the akhbar, the narrations which had come from the Imams. And aql was understood in at least three different directions, from the three different sides. For those who were interested in dialectics, in what was emerging as a serious field of theology, of ilm al-kalam, they understood aql to mean a basic instrument for discerning truths. It was ultimately reason, and of course reason as a faculty which is provided by the divine, but reason nevertheless as an independent way of discerning truth from falsehood, and as a means for debating and disputing with others. For those who were philosophically inclined, it was much more akin to the Neoplatonic nous. It was the first hypostasis emanating from the One. It was the ultimate being from which all other beings emanated. And still yet, for those who were perhaps more mystically or gnostically inclined, it was an esoteric guide, a sacred intelligence, an hiérât intelligence, as Amir Mozi would have put it. So already amongst those who defined themselves as Imami in the 9th century, there were at least 3 different ways of approaching this issue of aql as well. And we find that these different positions are present not only in the hadith collections as they emerge in the 9th century, they're also present in the various witnesses we have from hagiographical literature of the companions of the Imams who were supposed to have been the first defenders of that particular faith, the first defenders of the cause in that period. Now, in terms of the actual study of this period of theology, Imami theology, one of the striking things is that most academics who have looked at this have tended to study what the companions were up to, and then what particularly the early theologians, people like Sheikh Saduq, Sheikh Mufid and others, how they expounded on a particular doctrine of the nature of God, attributes the nature of the Quran, ethics, anthropology, the afterlife, and so forth. But there's actually very little work which has been done on the actual statements, particularly theological statements which are attributed to the Imams. Now, I'm going to entirely bracket the question about whether 9th or 10th century texts necessarily convey word for word, or even in a general sense of the meaning of what the Imam said. That's not really relevant for me. What I'm interested in is how did the tradition see teaching which was coming from these individuals, and how did they try and make sense of it? And if one wants to really understand the emergence of early Imami Kalam, and then later, of course, how the tradition amongst theologians and philosophers then received this, I think we really do need to pay far more attention to the actual texts. And one thing that the actual text, paying attention to the text will do, is it will stop us from reverting to an old stereotype, which is that the early Imami community were, broadly speaking, either anthropomorphists or rather simplistic people of hadith, and had very straightforward views about the nature of law and so forth. And then gradually, as they made their way to the big city and got involved with far more sophisticated individuals in Baghdad, that there emerged through these encounters a far more rational, a far more systematic approach to theology, which then culminates in what's known as the Baghdad school. And so you have this notion of the hadith folk of Qum being pitted against the rationalists of Baghdad. And this, to a large extent, is a myth which still pervades. Even now, it's surprising how many individuals in Shi'i communities, even in fairly learned contexts, will talk about the revival of this old school of Qum as somehow more pristine and unsullied by the foreign Greek influences of the Mu'tazili influenced mutakallimin, such as Sheikh Mufid and others. And this is partly because, in a sense, what I'm trying to raise is some of the fundamental tensions in trying to understand what Shi'ism is, which was there in the 9th century and still very much remains the case. We all know, for example, Ghulu and Taqsir are still the poles around which arguments take place today. And to a certain extent, Qum and Baghdad are also the poles of argument which still take place today. And part of that relates to the very use of disputation, of a very engagement in metaphysical speculation, and whether that speculation in itself is permissible. I'm not going to provide an argument for why I think it is permissible. There's so much evidence in the texts themselves of the Imams engaging in jadal, mujadala, munaẓarā. The terms are used, and why would they not? Particularly, there's a recent-ish, very interesting piece by Benjamin Abrahamov particularly on the roles of Imam Sadiq and Imam Riḍā, on their role in articulating theology and theological ideas, and how they engaged in disputation. And of course, it's important to remember that Jabal in itself is a Quranic term. It's sometimes a bit misleading to assume that theology only came about because the topics of Aristotle was translated into Arabic as the Jabal, and somehow that suddenly led to people disputing. Well, if we are to believe later texts, Muslims were disputing far earlier, and if we are to take the Quran as a fairly early witness, then clearly the Prophet and the people around him were disputing with people around them from the beginning. There's also plenty of evidence from the contemporaries of those sort of middle period Imams of the use of Mujadala, Mujalasa, Munaẓarā as vehicles for the elaboration of theological ideas. You find it, for example, amongst Ibadis, you find it particularly amongst Zaydis, and one of the contemporaries actually of Imam Riḍā, the Zaydi Imam al-Qasim, has a number of works which are called Munaẓarāt, which are particularly refutations against people he's supposed to have debated. I'm actually going to focus a bit later on one particular text, but I want to preface that, and that's a disputation which is recorded in a 10th century text of Imam Riḍā. But first, before that, I want to give you some of my speculations about how we should, in a sense, read the texts and how we should read the Hadith corpus as such. It's surprising how many people think that when they're reading a Hadith text, they're trying to read and grasp something which is true, which is a statement of fact, which will somehow allow them to understand a point of law or a basic point about the social reality that we live. And I find this a bit problematic because it doesn't pay attention, and also part of that is dealing with the logistics of how that text came to us, examining the integrity and probity of the people who transmitted it and so forth. The problem with such an approach is it doesn't pay sufficient attention to the actual content of what's being said. It doesn't pay sufficient attention to, in some ways, the elocutionary acts which are involved in what is said. What perhaps is being performed and enacted in those statements and encounters, and it doesn't pay enough attention to the context in which we find it. And this is one of the very useful ways of, particularly I think, if we look at something like a Munaẓarā has a particular type of setting. It has a certain types of rules of the structure of it. There, at times, are very interesting details were given about where people are placed, how they behave, what others who are around it are doing, around the debate are doing. And often these things which are seen to be peripheral are left out. But if we actually look far more at these sort of texts as performance pieces, as basically literary artifacts, as works of literature, it allows us to, in a sense, understand a bit more about the nature of the performance which is being done, and also how those individuals who then receiving these texts, disseminating the texts from the 10th century, perhaps how they might see things. I've got a couple of very ridiculously complicated paragraphs, but I'll just sum it up in a very quick sentence by saying what I think is really happening is the text, as it's then captured in writing and disseminating, is trying to capture an experience. It's trying to capture what it means for the Imam to be present, to be communicating, what it means in a sense to read the Imam, read that performance. And then it's conveying it in words, and then it's then for the people who then read it, who perform it, who enact those texts, to then continue with a process of then retranslating that text back into the experience and that presence. Because ultimately the only reason I would argue that people are interested in those texts is because they want to, in a sense, grasp what that experience was, or grasp or achieve that particular presence. So if they're reading that particular Munaẓarā where the Imam is debating with leaders of religious communities, they want to get a sense of what it was to be there, what the nature of that performance is, what is actually being conveyed, and then how those words and texts are striking, in a sense, the heart. I have perhaps a very Neoplatonic approach to text, which is that the text is supposed to capture something which is then supposed to be retranslated into an experience which transforms that self which is reading the text. It's supposed to strike the heart. Damascus has this wonderful metaphor where he says that the reason why you read particular texts in particular order is that you want to unlock certain keys, certain words which will strike the heart and transform the self, because ultimately the process of learning, of acquiring knowledge, is about that process of self-transformation. And if one thinks that the text that one is studying has a certain privileged nature with respect to knowledge, with respect to imparting certain ways of looking at reality, then it's that those teachings that one wants to internalize through the reading of that text to revive that particular experience, to revive that notion of presence. I'm not sure if I'm making much sense, but I'm kind of working this out as I'm going along. It only really came to me today, so it's perhaps something we can discuss later. And it's also partly because it comes back to the point I made earlier about the privileged nature of the knowledge of the Imam, but also the notion of his mastery of nutq in the dual sense that it's used. Nutq also in terms of being rational, being able to debate discursively, but also in a sense a mastery of language. It's one of the reasons why there are so many, again from very early collections, there are so many narrations about the mastery of not only of language through eloquence, through the ability to produce communication which is utterly effective, but also the mastery of a whole range and every language that there is. Coming to the actual text itself, the text is narrated. It's collected by Sheikh Saduq, as I mentioned before, who is a 10th century tradent associated with the so-called School of Qom. He died in 991. And he provides two recensions of it, which are broadly the same. One in Kitab al-Tawheed and the other one in Uyun Akhbar al-Riḍā. The second one being a collection which is particularly devoted to Imam Riḍā and narrations about him, what he said, and particularly his disputations. The text is also, these two collections are also dedicated to Sheikh Saduq's patron, Sahib ibn Abbad, who was the vizier of Fakhr Dawla, the Vizier Amir of Jabal, which is centered on Ray, northern Iran. Sahib ibn Abbad himself was a famous Mu'tazili intellectual. And to a certain extent, it seems quite obvious that someone like Shaykh Saduq, who of course has this reputation for being one of the hadith folk, is at the same time putting forward works which he thinks will appeal to the rational inclinations of someone like the vizier. His own particular source for this, Saduq's source for these Munaẓarāt, is a 9th century narrator called Abul Hasan Ali al-Nawfali, who allegedly in one of it's suggested that he might actually have been a companion of Imam Riḍā. It's not very clear, but al-Nawfali seems to have narrated and transmitted a number of works, including historical works, some of which have survived and are cited in works by al-Tabari, by Abul Faraj al-Isfahani and others. So that's in a sense where he's deriving the works. And then a number of other individuals after Saduq then also quote the same Munaẓarāt, often in abbreviated ways. So for example, the Ihtijaj, which is a 12th century text of Tabrisi, has an abbreviated copy of most of the Munaẓarāt, and the abbreviation is also such that he actually gets the name of Nawfali wrong when he's quoting it. It happens all the time. Now, in the actual Munaẓara itself, the particular one I want to just talk about very briefly, and I'm running rapidly out of time, is what's known as, or sometimes called, this inter-religious majlis. And others have already discussed other aspects of it. So, for example, the debate with the Exilat, the Rosh Golah, has been discussed by David Wasserstrom. The debate with the Catholicos, the Jathaliq, has been discussed by David Thomas. But as far as I know, the particular section which I'm interested in, which is the debate with Imran the Sabian, has not been discussed in the academic literature. And it is precisely that text which is extensively glossed in the Safavid period and later. I know of Ahwal Buzurg, for example, mentions 4 commentaries. I've come across about 6. And in many ways the most interesting and in some ways the most outlandish is the commentary by Sayyid Kazim Rushdie, the famous Shi'i leader of the middle of the 19th century, but also in some ways by far the most interesting commentary. Now, the text of this particular Munaẓara is very long, and I don't want to particularly gloss it in much detail, but what I'll do is I'll take you through a couple of early sections and try and comment on some of the aspects and say something about the setting first. The setting. This is, of course, the Majlis of Ma'mun. One of the things which Ma'mun is famous for doing is for providing platforms for debate and disputation. Those who have talked about the middle Abbasid period and the relationship with the emergence of theology and philosophy, such as Dimitri Gutas, have argued that these disputations were particular ways in which Abbasid imperial ideology could be disseminated, and ideas about the Abbasid Da'wah in particular could be disseminated, and the superiority of the Abbasid Da'wah could be demonstrated. And what the Abbasids did was that they actually had, in a sense, special court officials who were called mutakallimin, whose job it was to act as those propagandists who would disseminate the message. And some of actually the Munaẓarāt of Imam Riḍā are particularly with individuals who were called mutakallimin in this sense. So there's a famous one with a chap called Sulaiman al-Marwazi, who was described as the mutakallim of Khurasan. which seems to suggest that he was an Abbasid official with that role, particularly in Khurasan, particularly in Marv. Now, of course, these majalis are the majalis of Ma'mun. But the way Nawfali and, of course, the way Saduq presented it is that they are the majalis of Imam Riḍā, because he is the central character. If one looks at it as a particular type of literary set piece with characters, with emplotment, with a development of a certain type of narrative, then it's clearly Ma'mun is not at the center of it. Ma'mun might be the center of other kinds of records of disputations, such as in Mas'udi and others, but he's not in this. And Ma'mun, the other characters, the disputants, the individuals who are at court are very much side characters who are about the facilitation. What is the function of this disputation? It's to establish ultimately the superiority of the central aspect of that amr, so to speak, of the imams, and that is their knowledge. One of the variants of that amruna sa'ab mustas'ab, which I mentioned earlier, is ilmuna sa'ab mustas'ab. So it already indicates that fundamentally at the center of this notion is the idea of knowledge. And throughout the encounter, it is the superiority of knowledge which is being fundamentally demonstrated. And when at the end of that set piece, at the end of the disputation, the opponent is vanquished and he accepts, in a sense, his defeat by submission, and the very last phrase of the encounter with Imran the Sabiyan is that he declares his faith, belief in Imam Riḍā, and then goes into prostration. It's an act of submission. Brings the whole set piece to a culmination. And it also has, I think, a very strong Quranic echo of the encounter between Moses and the sorcerers at the court of Pharaoh. And of course in the Quranic encounter as well, although it is the court of Pharaoh, it is very much Moses who is at the center of the play, the performance, and it is the role then of the sorcerers. And then, of course, what happens, how does Pharaoh respond? Well, again, in the text, you have a very similar type of response from Ma'mun. Ma'mun's not entirely pleased with the way things have gone because he's been decentered from his own play, the performance that is going on. So that's setting the scene in some ways, and I think actually this sort of literary analysis, this kind of contextualization of what sort of performance, what experience is being enacted, as I mentioned before, is something which I think would be a really useful way of looking at some of these texts. It's a very different way of approaching it. I'm not sure if anyone there has done this, but it would be interesting to do it, sample it across a number of different types of texts. In terms of the actual wording, I'll just deal with two questions which are debated. And this particular section starts with Imam Riḍā saying, people, and the word uses qawm. Qawm already in the early 9th century, but certainly later, is used technically. It doesn't just mean people. It means experts of a particular field. So if qawm is used in a theological sense, it means theologians. And in this context, it's clear that we're talking about theologians, or people who are experts in disputation. So people, if there's someone amongst you who basically is not a Muslim, who differs with Islam and wishes to dispute, then let him ask. And interestingly also, and let him feel no shame. By saying that phrase, ask, and it says غير محتشمة. That suggests already a relationship in which the Imam is already privileging himself over others. So if he's saying to ask anything, don't feel shame, it's a bit like saying, well, I'm clearly brighter than you. But don't feel bad about it. You probably will think you're asking a really intelligent question, but it might not be. But don't worry about it. That's not my role is actually to facilitate. And it's little giveaway words like this which are really interesting in terms of how the whole story is implotted. And so this guy Amran, the Sabian, gets up and he says, and he was one of the mutakallimin, one of those specialists of disputation. And then he addresses Imam Riḍā and he says, Ya alim al-nas. Now this is a very strange phrase. You know, alim, of course, in the sense of someone who's a scholar. It again has an echo for those who know the hadith corpus. They know that it is only the imams who are the ulama. So using alim al-nas, you know, the scholar of mankind, I guess, or you know, the scholar of the people, is almost already before this dispute has taken place, is already a recognition of the superiority of the person who's being addressed. It says, if you had not invited people to debate you, I would not have risen to put forward these questions to you, for I have been to Kufa, Basra, Damascus, Jazeera, and so forth, and met theologians, yet not one of them has proven to me the existence of the one, apart from whom there is none, and who is alone in his oneness. Do you permit me to ask the same question of you? So you have the scene is set in the sense that this is an individual who in effect is making an act of recognition of the person who he's going to then ask a question of, but also has a fundamental issue which he has not been satisfied with. You know, he's been around basically the Muslim world, he's been around learned circles, and he hasn't been satisfied with their demonstration that there is one, i.e. there is a God. The response of Imam Riḍā is very interesting. He says, oh, you must be Imam the Sabian. Which again, you know, indicates again this notion of privileged knowledge. How does he know this? He's never met him before. He's not supposed to have met him before. It's another act of recognition which is part of this implotment. And of course, Imran says, I'm he. And he says, well, of course, you know, please ask, but be judicious in the way you ask. Do not prattle and be unfair in the way in which you debate. And so it goes on. I should probably wrap up, shouldn't I?
You've still got a bit of time.
Yeah. The reason why I'm stressing some of these side issues is because, again, I want to stress this notion of the context in which this is taking place and how it's being enacted and performed. And of course, the Imam then says, ask whatever you will. And as the scene is set, as the debate is about to take place, the phrase says, and people gathered around him. The suggestion, it's not clear whether we're talking about Imran or whether you're talking about the Imam, or maybe both. So much so they were practically on top of each other. So you've got this idea that, you know, sort of, it's very crowded. You know, there's a court scene. Now, I'm not entirely sure, it's very difficult to know exactly how the court might have worked, but you would expect that people wouldn't literally be standing into each other, so to speak. But again, it's the idea that people are really interested. This is something which is important, which is interesting, which is taking place. And once this happens, once this is mentioned, Imran asks the first question and he says, tell me about the first being, al-Ka'in, al-Awwal, and what it created. It's interesting that the term used is al-Ka'in, al-Awwal, because we know from early Kalam that a lot of the language of ontology that was being used was not the later philosophical language of wujud, it was actually language around